On to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 20th meeting of 2020. The first agenda item today is to decide whether to take agenda item 3 on the working group to improve budget information in private. Are members all agreed? Anyone that doesn't agree with that, then they can put a no in the chat box. You're all agreed. Thank you. So we move on to item 2, and today we begin taking evidence from stakeholders on the committee's Green Recovery inquiry. We'll hear from 3 experts in over 3 separate panel sessions today. And firstly, I'd like to welcome Benny Higgins, the chair of the Advisory Group on Economic Recovery. Good morning, Mr. Higgins. It's nice to have you with us.
Good morning.
I'd like to Good morning. I'd like to open things up. We've obviously had the programme for government published last week, and there's an awful lot of ask of the programme for government, given that we're in this economic crisis, this health crisis at the moment. We've got the triple goals of a transition to net zero, rebuilding, I suppose, a robust, resilient economy that's been assaulted by COVID-19, and the other goal of equity and fairness in society. I'd like to know your thoughts on whether the programme for government, as published, can achieve all those 3 things, and if not, what's missing from it?
Yes, well, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, if I maybe perhaps momentarily go back to the advisory group's report, which we published in June, we were very clear that we needed to build a robust, resilient, well-being economy. We chose all of those words very carefully because all of them do matter, and it's not an easy task. It wouldn't be an easy task under any circumstances, and the COVID situation, the health crisis, has only intensified the difficulty. I think what's very important is that we are measuring our progress properly. Now, the National Performance Framework, I think, is one of the most progressive things that Scottish Government has done. I'm a big fan of the National Performance Framework, but one of the things we suggested in our advisory report was that we adopted the 4 pillars of capital approach to look at Scotland's balance sheet as we progress. And they are the financial and physical pillar of capital, natural capital, human capital and social capital. And the response to the report from Scottish Government was very clearly positive about doing so. So I was a little disappointed, if I'm honest, that in the programme for government it hasn't been used or referred to as far as I could see. I hope that that's not a sign of it being dropped as quickly as it was picked up, but I think that is a very important way to consider the balance sheet of a country. So turning to the programme for government itself, when we read through, there's a great deal there, and as it should be. The challenge isn't whether or not the announcement of things that are going to be done or planned are being announced, it's whether they get done or not. And I think we have never lived in a time when it's the execution of plans, the execution of change, that matters any more than it matters today. So the test isn't writing it down, the test is doing it. And I think what we need to see in the country now is quick progress on things that matter most to give us confidence moving forward.
And so the quick progress in the things that matter most, what would they be in your view?
I think I've said this a number of times now. I do think that young people are very vulnerable in this COVID crisis. I mean, people certainly between the mid-teens to the mid-20s. And we just have to make sure that as we build a well-being economy, an economy that's based on a green spine, an economy that's about fairness, that we create the opportunities for these young people to be trained and subsequently employed. So I think we've got to do it in the context of a green recovery focused on the net zero target, but we've got to create jobs and we've got to create the education-led recovery, the training and reskilling recovery that the younger people need. So when I think about what we need to do, my primary focus is on building an economy that is resilient, that's green, that's got a well-being mantra and characteristics. But right now, I'm very fearful for those young people. And I think in the context of all of that, we have to make sure that we protect and shelter their future.
Other countries have responded to their own economic situation, particularly post the height of COVID, or what we hope is the height of COVID, by investing a great deal of a percentage of their GDP in their green recovery. I mean, that seems to me something that seems necessary. It's going to take a lot of investment to get us out of this. Do you feel that the Scottish Government has got the levers to be able to do that? And if so, where do you see them working in the PFG or not working? And if not, what do they need to actually make that investment?
Yeah, you make a very good point, and something, again, I've said before, I'm on record as saying, is that the Germans, who are not a bad guide to what you might do in these circumstances, have, post the emergency steps, are investing stimulus of 4% of their GDP. 4% of Scotland's GDP is £6 billion, and within the fiscal framework we are restricted to 450 million, which is 0.3% of GDP. So quite frankly, we don't have the levers to invest the amount that would be reasonably required as stimulus to come out of this crisis. I don't think that it's reasonable or feasible for us to imagine that we could change the whole fiscal framework in a time frame that is consistent with the emergency that we face. So I think we have to somehow find a way to work with Westminster to either get them to invest something that's commensurate with the crisis and spread through the devolved nations, or find some other mechanism. So there's lots of things we can do, but at the heart of it, we don't have the capacity to unilaterally in Scotland invest the kind of numbers that, even if it wasn't 4%, 2% is 3 billion. And these numbers at the moment are a long, long way away from the amounts being invested, which is why we can talk about programmes, we can talk about a lot of things, but we've got to pay for them.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring in my colleagues now. We've got Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Higgins. I'd like to pull this back to focus more on what this committee is about. It's the green recovery, and whilst we all understand that it needs to be a just transition, I'd like to focus on some of the policies around the environment. We all know that COVID has changed the way we're living, and a lot of that's to the better. So we're travelling less, we're more conscious about the miles we're doing, people are working from home and so on. But there's also the other policies that have been there for a while. So we have one of the headline policies is more afforestation. So we're looking to plant far more trees across Scotland. Now, that's one of these policies that would appear to have a major impact, something we can do very quickly. But what I would actually like to ask you is what about how much work has been done looking at the short-term gains that we can get, and then looking at what maybe the long-term sustainable gains are. Again, forestry, we've got to look at a whole different range of things about the pitfalls and land use, the change from agricultural land to forestry, biodiversity, water quality, all these sort of things. I'm concerned that we might not be doing the research. But given your position on the AGER, can I ask you what policies you see would give immediate impacts, but also recognise the implications for a longer term green recovery and our race, if you like, to get to net zero by 2030?
No, again, a very good question, and I think we do need to. It's very difficult to talk about the COVID crisis in any positive way. I mean, it does seem kind of dissonant. But I think we do have to take the opportunity of a crisis of this scale to reassess what does matter most and do the right things. And we need to use the climate change challenge, I think, to support the economic recovery and to create jobs. I do believe that, in the programme for government, there was a commitment to invest 150 million over the next 5 years in forestry. I think that's very welcome. I think we have to think harder about what we do in the rural economy more generally. Scotland has very rich natural resources. We have, clear biodiversity, and I think it has to be central to our economic and environmental and our well-being economy. So these are very important things. I think we do need to look hard at incentives, and this again comes back to within the fiscal framework what is possible, but I think we should be looking at how we incentivise the right kind of behaviours, whether it be in forestry, in the rural world. We do need in rural, a slight digression here, but in terms of digital resilience, we need a stronger platform there to support the sort of home working that you mentioned there. I don't think home working exclusively, this is a very personal opinion, I'm not sure that is necessarily the healthiest future, but I do certainly see for those of us that are lucky enough that we can actually work from home, that will be a feature of how we work in future, but not necessarily the only way we want to do it or be able to. So I think it's around strengthening incentives. I think we've also got to look at those industries that are carbon dependent and look at ways in which we can support them reducing those carbon emissions. That's one of the things we have to think about. Although the net zero is the international standard, I think we need to look at how we target emissions themselves too.
Okay, in the recently published Oxford Review of Economic Policy, it said that investment in natural capital was one of the highest scoring economic recovery policies, both in terms of climate change, which we're obviously interested in, but also in economic benefits. So can you tell me which policy or combination of policies did you identify as having an immediate impact when it comes to the natural economy?
I don't think it's I think the nature of the natural economy is that it does require patient investment. This is where I may come to it in another question, but as you probably know, it's almost exactly 3 years ago today that I was approached by the First Minister's office to put together the plan for a Scottish National Investment Bank. And the bank's absolutely core target will be to play its part in creating a net zero economy. And it's about mission-led investment. It's about patient capital. I'm afraid that when it comes to some of that, I think we have to try and engineer the right behaviours within our society and the right mindset within our society very quickly and see where we can get to. But in terms of some of the most important investments, they will require the patience that the Scottish National Investment Bank can bring to bear. And I think it's probably one of the most important developments in Scottish economic policy for a generation at least.
Can I bring in Mark Ruskell on this? Mark.
Yeah, morning, Benny. One of the things that was missing from your report was a clear recommendation on energy efficiency. Yet we are seeing countries like France and Germany maximising investment into energy efficiency as part of their green recovery. Why was that?
Yeah, I don't want to sound too apologetic because, we did try and cover a lot of ground in a very short space of time. Actually, government's response to our recommendations and imploring them to make sure it was a green recovery did make mention of domestic energy. So whilst we might not have mentioned it very directly, it was picked up very quickly. So I don't think we weren't trying to make a point of not making specific reference. I think we probably did more indirectly, and as I say, it was certainly picked up. But it is very important, there's no question about that, so let there be no doubt that we do recognise the importance.
Right, I'll bring in Angus MacDonald.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Benny. Just looking specifically at the financial support and fiscal stimulus, the AGA report identifies that there's a strong case for the Scottish Government to have greater autonomy to use targeted fiscal measures to stimulate demand or incentivise behavioural change in the recovery period. And it also states that it identified a number of policy areas in which the Scottish Government it could make significant progress in the recovery and renewal phase. So we've kind of touched on this already, but in the context of green recovery, based on your AGR work, which policy areas did you identify where the Scottish Government could or should have greater autonomy to target fiscal measures to stimulate demand and incentivise positive behaviour in the context of a green recovery?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that what we were saying is that the stimulus needs to be of the kind of quantum that we've already referred to in response to an earlier question. And of course, if we were, let's even say we had 2%, £3 billion to invest in the Scottish economy, the specific areas where the spending needs to be done is in projects that will play their part in getting us to net zero by 2045. It needs to be in training that prepares people of all ages, but especially young people, for the kinds of jobs that we can expect in the mid-21st century. So there is no shortage of areas to invest in that are consistent with a green recovery and consistent with skilling Scotland to be ready for that and to be more attractive for inward investment. We haven't talked much about inward investment, but I think that the leading economies of the mid-21st century will be those that do focus on well-being, those that do focus on net zero, those that have a green spine to their recovery from COVID, and those that have trained and reskilled the people of, as I say, all ages, young and old, in preparing for what's coming next, and has got the kind of digital infrastructure that's required so that we are more resilient. I mean, we don't know what the next crisis will be, but one thing's for sure, it might not be our generation, but there will be one. And Scotland, like many countries, all countries really, needs to be better prepared for that. So I think there's absolutely no shortage of things that we could invest in here, but it needs to be very focused on a green recovery, that's for sure.
Okay, thanks. And you mentioned the Scottish National Investment Bank. I'm curious as to how you would say that the SNIB should apply mechanisms or assessments to ensure that the SNIB capital aligns with the goal of delivering a green recovery and supporting a net zero future.
Yeah, so the fundamental premise behind the Scottish National Investment Bank is that it is patient capital mission related. It comes originally from the work by Mariana Mazzucato at UCL, who I got to know well during the last few years. And by its very definition, you have to choose missions which she would describe as grand societal challenges. And there's no question that Scottish Government has decided, I think quite rightly, that the grandest societal challenge we face is an economic recovery that creates jobs, but as a green recovery with a green spine. So it's perfectly matched with what the bank was set up to do. I mean, I have said to a number of people, some people say to me, well, do you think the bank where does the bank sit relative to COVID? Well, if we hadn't started building the bank almost exactly 3 years ago today, we'd need to start now, and it wouldn't be ready for 3 years because of the parliamentary process and the state aid things that you have to do, and also building an organisation, building an institution. So I think it will be a great it will really support and make Scotland's potential progress through post-COVID much more likely and stronger, because the bank could not be more fit for purpose. And although it will have more than one mission in the long run, there is no question that it's pretty much its sole mission. Although that will touch technologies, it will touch a lot of things, is going to be about getting us to 2045 in the way that we should.
Well, that's certainly a bit of good news in the current climate. Thank you, Convener.
And can I bring in Liz Smith?
Thank you very much. You've been very interesting this morning about the requirement for a culture change. And you said in your report, you hinted that there's a little bit of disappointment that engagement by government with business had not always been firing on the right cylinders. And I just wondered what you feel we have to do to ensure that there is a complete joined up thinking about trying to change this culture and really good engagement by government with business, because obviously we're not going to succeed unless that happens.
No, I think that is true. So I think the first point to make is when we are facing both the crisis that we are in and is not going away in a hurry, and we also face, I think, opportunities to do things differently, there has never been a more important time for us to work together. There's never been a more important time for the public sector, the private sector, the third sector, because too often the third sector is forgotten in this and plays a very important role. And in my interactions with the third sector, we have some extraordinary able people in Scotland in that sector. They have a part to play here about what a wellbeing economy looks like. So that is the first point. We need to work together. The second point is that it's very easy to talk about working together, but you've actually got to do it. And there are cynics out there on all sides of all the divides that think it's the other side that's at fault. One thing I said to the First Minister privately was, when there's any relationship and one side of it doesn't think it's working, it isn't. You can't just say pretend it is, it isn't. And there's a question about fault, but actually, almost in every case, fault lies on both sides. And I think that's true in this instance. So just to be clear, I think government can and should do more, but I think business also has to be ready to position itself to deal with the relationship better. And I don't think all trade bodies, and I won't pick on any for obvious reasons, but I don't think all trade bodies necessarily represent their sector as brilliantly as they would like to think so, or maybe even say so. So we do need to rethink this, but there's nothing beats working together. And that's one of the big pleas I've made, is that we've got enough to do, that's for sure. The conversation this morning is a further illustration and reinforcement of that. We've got to get people who have got good private sector experience to work hand in glove with government to get some of this stuff done. And I think working together is what breaks down the barriers. We do have to think through whether the existing framework of meetings between government and business works. I think the sort of royal visit from politicians, which might get mentioned many times, as we've spoken to X number of businesses in the last few weeks or the last few months, I'm not sure they don't change the world. It's working on real things, making things happen. And I know that in the last 3 years working with government, not full time, but quite a lot, I've learned a lot about how it works. I've learned a lot about what you need to do to get things done. And I hope that others have enjoyed working with me too. So it is really important, I think, that we get more people to work with government. Even the bank itself, Willie Watts, Willie Watts, the chair, Aileen McTaggart is the chief executive, and they're in the middle of bringing in a lot of others who will have a lot of private sector experience. I think it's not that the private sector is stronger. I've met the most extraordinarily able people who are in the public sector. I think we just need to get them all to work together. So that would be my biggest plea. There are other things we can do, but working together will make the biggest difference.
Just to build on that, a comment that you made about jobs in the 21st century and getting people to understand, both in business and in government, exactly what these jobs are going to be. Could I just ask you what engagement is happening in terms of working with colleges and universities and those who are training on apprenticeships to get people to have a better understanding of what the skills are for a green recovery? I mean, is there a lot of engagement happening that you're aware of, or do we need to do much more on that basis?
No, I think there's been a huge amount of engagement. I know that Nora Senior's report, talked about that engagement, and there's been a huge amount done. But I always come back to the same point: we need to get on and do it. It's a lot. I mean, it's very often easy to say what needs done. It's just a lot harder to do it. And this is the time when we have to really get on and do things. The important thing is that I don't think it would take anybody any length of time to work out that we are going to have different kinds of jobs in the next 20 years. We're going to need, therefore, different skills. And, it has been, certainly I've said a couple of times that, without sounding too enigmatic about it, that in some ways inequality is a race between education, training and technology. And if technology gets too far ahead of skill training and education, inequality is the consequence. So we live in a time when the COVID crisis has illuminated the inequality divide in this country and others to a much greater extent. It even has caused some. I mean, classically, as I wrote in the report, 50% of people who earn the most in the country can work from home comfortably, and only 90% of them can, and only 10% of the bottom 50. So even the whole thing about home working, I also think that coming out of the COVID crisis, people, inequalities also get exposed in terms of the choices people make. Some people have no choice but to use public transport, other people have choices, and so on. So we do need to make sure that the training and it needs to be an education-led recovery. I think green and education for me are the two big things that will get us to the other side, whatever and whenever that is, in much better shape. And I think digital plays a big part in it. We've got too much digital poverty in the country. We don't have the resilience. And rural Scotland, I think, has got a big part to play, but it needs to be supported to get there. So I don't think there's any shortage of the right conversations. Let's just, fingers crossed, we've got to get on with it with energy and gusto. I mean, on the Scottish Job Guarantee, Sandy Begbie's come in and he will be leading the Scottish Job Guarantee for young people. And that's the kind of thing we need to do. And that hopefully will also not just get kids jobs, but it will get kids training and get them prepared for the future too.
Can I bring in Stuart Stevenson?
Thank you, Convener. I'm beginning to see there might be a job for me after retirement, because from my doing a presentation to Sainsbury's to opening Sainsbury's Bank only took us 6 months. However, that's incidental. I want to just probe Mr. Higgins about jobs, basically in industry in particular. We've got two challenges. The low carbon fund, is it big enough to help our industrial and manufacturing sector? But also, we've got a major industry in the northeast of Scotland, although there are many representations right across the country, that is oil and gas, and huge numbers of highly skilled jobs. Are we paying enough attention to that? Is there fund to aid transition in that industry, and is the low carbon fund in the programme for government going to be enough to make the transitions that we need to make for the green agenda, but also for the very many people whose jobs are going to be obsoleted by changes and will have to find new jobs?
Yeah, look, again, a good question. Earlier I was asked about what one would do if you had the fiscal stimulus, which was more commensurate with what we're facing. Well, the green fund would be one place you would go very quickly. I think we've got to make sure. I mean, people say to me, is £2 billion on the balance sheet of the Scottish National Investment Bank enough? And the answer I always give, well, probably not, and almost certainly not. But let's deploy it properly. And get on with it, and I think we need to do that with the Green Fund. But ideally, it would be a lot bigger. And I think we should not shirk from saying we need to look at the North East and make sure we do the right things. We can make a big difference to the net zero target by doing the right things there. There will be redundant apparatus there. Dieter Helm, who is a very able member of the group which I chaired, is speaking to you later. He has got a lot more expertise in this than I do, but in terms of carbon sequestration and storage, we've talked about it for a long time. Again, I think we should have no shame in thinking that ideas that have been around a long time get done now. It's this idea that everything we do to recover from COVID has to be novel is, for me, just kind of silly. What we need to do is just say, what are the best ideas? Where are the areas where we have to take action, we have to make interventions? And I think in the North East we do. And I think we can make a big difference to the green agenda. We can protect jobs. We can do very, very sensible things. And the more we can invest, the better. So I suspect at this juncture, we've got to make the most of what we've got, but we've got to push for more too.
Let me just come back and be quite specific. Are there particular initiatives that will be more likely than alternatives to move people, particularly with engineering and offshore energy skills, into new jobs that are green jobs? So there are particular things we're going to do there. And is there enough money on the table to help us do that? Because getting these very economically active and high contributors, continuing to be so. There is a public good in that, as well as a good for the individuals concerned.
No, I think you're right, but I got asked a very good question a few moments ago about how does the business sector and government work better together? How do they get things done? Because it's not, the word culture gets used very often, and there's no harm in using it. But what we're really talking about here is how do we make progress together? And I think maybe there is even more scope for, government to sit down with the private sector firms that are active in places like the North East and to understand what is possible, because there you've got the right balance of expertise and understanding what's possible. I think we shouldn't, as I said earlier, have any shame in saying that even though a sector may be carbon dependent, it can play a big role in taking us to net zero. It can play a big role in understanding how we protect jobs. I say this time and time again, it's in the context of wishing to create a fair, sustainable, well-being green economy. We have got this tidal wave of unemployment potentially facing us, and we can't sit back and let it happen. It will disproportionately affect some more than others, but this will be very widespread when you look at the numbers of people on furlough who are having self-employment support. We've got the bounce back loans from the banks that are coming up next year. I mean, I also do think that the banks have got to work more closely with government to work out how we're going to deal with this. And for a lot of the banks, I think most of the decisions get made in London, and that's life. But we've got to work out how Scotland can have bespoke support where it's needed.
I just wanted to come in briefly on the back of Stuart's question before I go to my colleague Mark Ruskell about that. And talking about North East oil and gas, there is an issue there about vested interests and people not wanting to change. And one very small niche aspect that could change right away is making it easier for people who had already got all their training certificates in oil and gas to work offshore, and they're not transferable across to renewables. And this is something that's been going on for years, and I hear from it all the time. But there's vested interest in getting largely self-employed people to pay for new training. So there's logjam there, but there's vested interest because there's a lot of companies that are making their living out of doing all this training. How do we sort out a girdle like that?
I think, look, there always have been vested interests, there always will be. I think the power of government is threefold. The first two we tend to hear about much more often. One is financial intervention, another one is policy intervention, both incredibly important. But what I've been becoming more and more focused on is government's convening power, to convene the right conversations between different parties to get to the right place. And I think we've got to have an opportunity here to talk to get government and private sector people who are on the axis that matters in these important areas, to have proper open conversations about what's best for everybody concerned, recognising that vested interests are always going to be present. It's interesting that during the period we were producing our report, which was just 8 and a bit weeks, so it was a pretty quick piece of work, but I was speaking to a number of international Scots who are doing big private sector jobs around the world, and one of them was Alan Jope, who runs Unilever. And one of the things that was most striking was that Alan realised that, running one of the biggest multinationals in the world, it was so important that the well-being principles that we talk about as a country in Scotland are very much at the heart of what they're trying to do. And he has a very firm view that if you don't create a fair, inclusive, sustainable well-being company, multinational, then ultimately you'll fail. And I think the convening of conversation between government and private sector in certain parts of the country, perhaps more than others, needs to be about recognising how do we work together. These problems don't go away unless we work together in an innovative, open, transparent way. I am ever the optimist that these conversations can be had, and I feel so sure that the right outcomes are the ones that we talk about in Scotland, and therefore we must have a very good chance of doing it if we approach it properly.
Thanks. Mark, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thanks, convener. Last week we saw the licensing, a new round of licensing for oil and gas in the North Sea. So, expansion, not a managed decline of the industry, but an expansion. How do you see that as compatible with the objectives of transition, of getting new livelihoods into low carbon jobs? I noticed in the report there's quite a heavy emphasis on, a hydrogen economy and carbon capture and storage, but years on, these still remain really speculative technologies. They're not actually real. I mean, you can't get a job in carbon capture and storage in the UK at the moment, can you? So I'm just wondering kind of how, but for communities that are looking for the future and where the real jobs are going to come from, do you think there's perhaps a bit too much emphasis on that?
Yeah, look, actually, I would encourage you to ask Dieter. I'd encourage you to ask Dieter when in his session. He's got a lot more expertise in carbon capture and sequestration and storage than I do. But one thing's for sure, based on what he said and what others in the field have said, I go back to an earlier comment. We may not have made the progress we should have, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. I think we do have to get on with it, and actually, the redundant frameworks and apparatus in the North East actually are ready made for it. So I think there's a lot more progress we can make on a number of dimensions of kind of natural capital and green recovery. If we've just got to be focused and invest. I don't know precisely what the plans are for the private sector businesses in the North East. Recently I was somewhat berated for mentioning that I thought that I was pleased to hear that BP had come out with a to contribute to net zero. I think if people like BP do it, then it is a good thing. I think we've got to be careful not to assume that they can't do the right thing. I mean, everybody's capable of working out how to make their contribution. I'm not close enough to any of the organisations in the North East or indeed elsewhere to be specific about their plans. But I get back to the same point, kind of rather repeatedly, which is I think we've got to make sure that there are incentives for companies in the North East to be moving in the right direction in oil and gas, and also to be working out what the convener mentioned about how do we sort of help people be repositioned for the right kinds of work as we move forward. So I'm not really qualified to give you a very precise answer to that question, but it's obviously an important consideration. But it depends very much on the arrangements and the plans that those organisations have got, I think.
Can I bring in Claudia Beamish? Oh, sorry, Mark, I didn't realise you weren't finished. But I'll go to Claudia after Mark. Mark, come back in.
Yeah, just a quick point. I mean, I think the question here is about, are we going to see a renewables-led recovery, or is this going to be a recovery that very much fits the agenda of the oil and gas industry and their corporate aspirations to maximise extraction, which are totally understandable from a point of view of a corporation. But if you're an oil and gas company, you're going to want to continue to invest in oil and gas. Whether that's the right way around, whether we should actually be creating livelihoods in other sectors that pull jobs over.
No, I agree, Mark. I think we do need to create jobs that pull the jobs over. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It's the question of what are the understandings and the agreements with the corporations to try and facilitate that happening more kind of seamlessly. And we do have to do a lot more. It has to be a renewable, green, education-led recovery, because that's the only thing that starts to tackle the big problems that we face in the world and we face in the country around inequality, around fairness, around well-being. We've got to do that, and we've got to find a way through it. I mean, one of the other expressions I often come back to is, things that are really worthwhile doing, and there is nothing more worthwhile in our lifetimes than have the right kind of recovery from COVID. They are usually very difficult. This is very, very difficult, and will require very careful choices and very close collaboration. And I hope the convening power of government to get it there.
I'd like to move on to talking about, you've mentioned very briefly about accessing private capital, Mr. Higgins, and Claudia Beamish has some questions around that. Claudia.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to you, Mr. Higgins. You've talked about the convening power of government and also about working together, and we've focused in our discussion so far on the Scottish National Investment Bank, and you've highlighted that it must be mission-led. I'd like to turn our thoughts to how all this can best connect, in your view, with access to private capital for public goods and a green recovery. And I know you have banking experience, and of course, and I suppose I'm very interested, as is the whole committee and far beyond this committee, to know about how to help to leverage in private capital. So many billions in funds, and we've got BlackRock in Edinburgh, and there's the risks of stranded assets and the confidence that's needed to be built for moving through a green recovery to net zero. So I wonder if you could share what thoughts you've got on how government and others can move forward on this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think let me sort of build out from the Scottish National Investment Bank in response to that very good question. When we were building the bank, it was important that we were building something that was additive and complementary to what already exists. So there's no point in Scottish Government creating a bank that simply tries to do what private sector institutions are doing. And there are two areas where we felt that there was a very material gap. One was on the scaling up of SMEs in Scotland. So if you're looking for a very modest amount of money in Scotland and you have a good business plan, let's say a few £100,000, I'm not saying that's not a lot of money, but at a kind of business level, you're looking for a few £100,000 to get going and you've got a good business plan, you'll probably get it. And if you are actually quite a big, medium-sized business and you're looking for tens of millions to improve and scale up your business, you'll probably get it from one of the bigger players. If you're in the middle, it gets single-figure millions, it's very difficult. And why that's important is because it, in some ways, can thwart ambition, and it's an area which needs to be served well. And then there is what we've already talked about, the long-term patient capital, which patient's the word that probably gives away why the private sector are sometimes less interested, because they're not patient, and they need, the payback period and the duration of the investment is too long for them. So the Scottish National Investment Bank is being architected to play in both those places. I think in both cases it can create a market for private sector investment, and it can also, to use the expression, crowd in some investment. So if, for example, taking the long-term patient capital, we could have a situation where there is a very significant green recovery project that could be, I won't make one up, I was going to make one up, I'll probably make a bad one up. So, but a very important project. Without government investment, the private sector in its various shapes and forms may take the view that it's too risky. But if 50% of the investment, for example, was maybe being made by the Scottish National Investment Bank with its different risk appetite, it effectively changes the perspective in terms of the risk appetite of the private sector. And so therefore we could have crowding in. But I also hope that by starting to build up that patient capital sector, we are making a market which can be played in by private sector. And going back to SMEs, one of the things that I do believe will increasingly become important is what's being kind of labelled as conditionality. And I think it's only right, as we do try and build this green recovery, that SMEs who are prepared to invest in the right kinds of things are given some kind of favourable status. That would also apply to digital. I don't think in Scotland the SME sector has really embraced the digital opportunities perhaps just as much as it could have. And we've learned through this crisis how important digital can be when we are in an environment where it's the way to transact, the way to be serviced, the way to communicate. And so I think we need to look at how government can, through the bank, crowd in investment, create a market, and at the SME level start to shape the right kinds of small businesses that can play the right part, the important part in the recovery.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. And now to questions from Mark Ruskell.
Thanks. In the forthcoming Scottish budget, what do you think the government should spend more on, and what do you think the government should spend less on?
Yeah, I think spending less on is always a hard question, but it's one of the best. Spending less is one of the best questions, but it's one of the hardest ones to answer. So I think we have got to just understand I think you've got to go back to first principles and what's most important. And I think a disproportionate investment in renewables, biodiversity, education, skills and training, digital infrastructure are the areas that can make the biggest difference. And to be honest, I think it's very hard to say where we should spend less. But the reality is that will, in some ways, if we work out what we should spend more on, there will have to be a strain somewhere else in the system, but not at the expense of individuals, because we do have issues in this country, as most in other countries do too, that we've got to make sure that we have a strong safety net for people, that we do protect them. So we can't let any of the strain be on those who have probably suffered more already during this crisis. But we do need to invest in the future, and I think it's the areas I've just touched on. If we're going to talk about a well-being economy, if we're going to talk about a fair work and sustainable economy, if we're going to talk about a modern well-being one, then we've got to say what are the areas that will give rise to that. And although I just alluded to it earlier, but we also need to build a country that is attracting inward investment. But the good news is an economy that is focused on being well-being, that's going to be resilient through stronger digital infrastructure, that supports it. And we also have to support sectors, I think, that have the absolute, well, not only do they have the capacity to thrive, they must thrive. You can't be good at everything. In a small, well-developed economy, you can't be good at everything, but we need to be good at certain things. I think we need to be good at education. We need to be good at technology hubs. We need to be good at tourism and hospitality. Dieter, again, will no doubt talk to this. He has said to me many times that he believes that Scotland has the capacity to be a world leader in natural capital and biodiversity. So, these are the areas where the investments must be made, and somehow or other we've got to make room for that. But if you forgive me, I probably won't try and pick off things that we should put down the pecking order.
Okay. In terms of those government investments in the, what do you think about conditionality, about saying, okay, we've got these well-being objectives, we've got the goal of net zero, tackling the nature emergency. If there's going to be government investment in the economy, it has to be conditional on those objectives being delivered, whether that's by oil and gas or any other sector. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think conditionality is something that we need to pursue with some vigour, to try and understand how we use it as a filter to make sure we invest in the right places, and we invest in projects and businesses that have the right focus and the right culture and the right attitude. I think it's important. I think, as with many things like this, it's much easier to say that quickly and move on as though it's very clear what we mean. I think we have to put in a fair amount of effort to be clear in our understanding of conditionality. And along the way, I think we've just got to make sure that we are the outcome of conditionality is that we create jobs in the right way, in the right sectors, with the right businesses, with people with the right skills. So it's not just, I think it has to be about job creation and economic growth, as well as creating a well-being economy, and that's what makes it complicated. But I don't think the conditionality will be a straightforward exercise, but I think it's worth the effort, because I think it's very important if we're serious about all this.
Right, need to move on to questions from Finlay.
Thank you, Convener. I would like to ask about policy coherence and delivery. Some of the stakeholders in response to this paper brought up the risks of lack of cohesion in policy making. Are you satisfied that the programme for government demonstrates that climate change is a thread through every policy, as you reported was a requirement in your the AGR report.
Yeah, look, as I go through the programme for government, I think on paper it is it's well lined up with the desire for net zero by 2045 and for a green recovery to be the basis of economic recovery in Scotland. But that's not, I mean, announcements are easy. The hard bit is, does the thread get executed as a thread? Because that's what is the making or breaking of it, I'm afraid. So I think that the setting out of a series of initiatives and areas of focus, if they are executed in a coherent way, then I think we will have a plan that is consistent with a green recovery. Of course, the other question which has come up in different shapes and forms this morning is there enough money in the pot to achieve it to the degree necessary? And I think that's a harder question to answer. Probably not.
And on a practical basis, how do you see the Scottish Government aligning its work with its partner agencies? So, for example, Scottish Enterprise or South Scotland Enterprise Agency, to ensure that this green recovery has the best chance possible?
Yeah, I mean, I've got to know the agencies very well through the work on the Scottish National Investment Bank and on the work with the Economic Recovery Group. And I have to say I'm very impressed by the people there. You know, at Scottish Enterprise, we've got, Robert Smith in the chair, and Steve Dunlop is a very, focused individual as the chief executive. We've got Alistair Dodds in High, and we've got Russell Griggs in the south of Scotland, all very keen to work together. And now we've got this new piece of economic apparatus that will open its doors in the next month or 2 or 3, which is the Scottish National Investment Bank. What will be the key is how these work in collaboration. There's no one that's a single, silver bullet. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but cooperation will be the key to unlocking the opportunities here. And it will require all of these organisations to work with government, to work with the universities, to work across our society. I think one of the benefits of Scotland being the size it is that we actually have got the capacity to do this brilliantly well, but I don't think we do. I think we need to work much more effectively together. But all it takes for people to work more effectively together is a willingness all round and an appreciation of what each other does, and a willingness to be transparent and very focused. So I'm an optimist, but we need to do it.
Can I bring in Angus MacDonald? Angus.
Okay, thanks, Convener. As you know, AGER recommended that the Scottish Government now needs to establish a priority on delivering transformational change with clear sector plans where the coincidence of emissions reductions, the development of natural capital and job creation are the strongest. So the Scottish Government's done that by setting out in their implementation plan how they intend to deliver the clear sector plans. But would you say those proposed plans are sufficient?
I think we need to do more. It goes back to another point I made earlier, which is the relationship between Scottish Government and the banks. As we are coming in, we've got 2 cliff edges coming up. One is the end of the furlough and other financial support schemes, and the other is the, if you like, the end of the term of the various business loans. Now the furlough one comes first, and then sometime next spring we have the bounce back loans, etc. Of course, you don't get to the very cliff edge before you feel the danger of the cliff edge, and I think we're starting to feel the danger of the furlough one, and it won't be long before we feel the danger associated with next year. I feel very strongly that government, again, back to the convening word, has to convene the conversation with the banks about how we protect certain sectors, certain kinds of businesses. It's harsh to say this, but it's not. None of us can seriously believe that there aren't going to be businesses that will fail. That is bound to happen. But there are sectors and businesses that we've just got to think through. How do we find a way to support them? I've already made some allusion to the kinds of businesses. I won't give all of them, therefore, by definition, suggesting some are those that should be allowed to fail. But we have to make sure that those businesses that are fundamentally strong and fundamentally can thrive in Scotland beyond this are there to thrive. And, you know, tourism and hospitality is a classic example. To think that Scotland wouldn't have a strong, fit-for-purpose tourism and hospitality sector, it's unthinkable. And so we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. The food and drink industry, the education sector has had an existential threat. I mean, only at the weekend I was talking to some people, and already we're starting to hear about even more students that were supposed to be arriving soon from abroad not turning up. And we must have a strong, thriving education sector in Scotland that goes way beyond universities, incidentally. But so I think we've got to be. This is one of the most important things that we've got to get right. It's one of the hardest things to get right, because you can't just chase down every possibility. You've got to be much more thoughtful about what does the prospectus for Scotland look like at a national level. What does this prospectus for Scotland look like at a regional and local level? And how do you work with the right local authorities, local enterprise agencies, government, private sector to try and get there? So nothing could be more important.
Okay, thank you.
And now to Claudia Beamish.
Stakeholders in response to ourselves have emphasised the lack of implementation of existing recommendations. If I give you one example, in the Eclair portfolio, that's the Scottish Nature Work, or the National it used to be called, which there's been a great deal of talk about for a very long time, but that hasn't happened. And Scottish Wildlife Trust had emphasised the major barrier to progress and a green recovery, that it hasn't happened. What's your view on the implementation gap that's been highlighted by stakeholders, and how the Scottish Government should seek to address this so that we don't fall into similar traps that have been highlighted? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely valid points to be made. In order to get things done, I don't want to sound patronising, but you need a plan. You need the right people to execute the plan, and you need more broadly the right resources for the plan. And in any walk of life, until you've got the plan, it feels a bit like hit and hope that anything will get done. So on everything that really matters, we need a sufficiently detailed plan with the deployment of the right expertise and capability and the right broader resources. So on anything for which that doesn't currently apply, until it does, the level of optimism that it will get done has to be sort of diminished as a result. So I think that's just stating a truism, but it's a very important one. And certainly, as we've gone through, for example, the building of the Scottish National Investment Bank, probably the thing I've been in my whole career most proud of being part of building. We have had from the very outset. I mean, we put together an implementation plan that was presented after a matter of months. And actually what's been quite striking is that implementation plan has served well in the building of the bank in the last 2.5 years. So it's further evidence about having the plan, having the people, having the resources, having the focus.
Thank you.
I've got final questions, and I think Mark Ruskell might want to come in the back of this, Mr. Higgins. So you talked at the very start of this session about your 4 pillars of capital and how we actually measure the well-being, the progress, the health of both economically and otherwise of Scotland, and these 4 pillars of capital being potentially measurements of that. As we go through this green recovery, I mean, what key indicators or milestones would indicate that we're on that green recovery? Is it using these 4 pillars? And also, I think off the back of that, bearing in mind that we're all politicians, with the exception of yourself around this virtual table, the short-termism of politics and the cries of politicians for things to be done quicker when we're talking about things that maybe have long-term vision or long-term investment, how compatible is that? Maybe should we be a lot more patient in how we view things and let things happen? A lot of questions in there, but I just thought I'd open that whole thing up.
I'm just wondering, Convener, if I should get Mark Russell's question and then try and answer them all together, or would you rather I just answered yours first?
Just carry on, I'll bring Mark in afterwards.
Okay, no worries, that's fine. Okay, so, yeah, look, to be prepared to invest in the long run is obviously a perennial issue for politicians, I guess, because I guess inevitably one worries about shorter term issues because that's where often the pressure lies. But as I said at the beginning of my AGAD report, if this crisis isn't a time to think differently, nothing ever will be. So I think this is the time to be prepared to get the right combination of long-term and short-term fixes. I mean, in any enterprise, whether it's a country or a business or a society, the short-term does matter. So we can't ignore the short-term. But if we don't invest in the long-term, we will be in we will be in a spiral that is not terribly helpful. The value of the 4 pillars is it takes stock of where you stand now. So you can start to try and assess the strength of your society and your economy under these 4 pillars. I think it also quite helpfully considers human and social as being part of your balance sheet. They are capital. So, for example, under the fiscal framework, any underspend on capital projects can't be spent on revenue projects or can't be spent on revenue. Now, because of COVID, there's a significant underspend on capital. Actually, maybe if we did think of the 4 capital model, we would realise that investing that, whatever it is, I suspect it's in the 500+ million, if we were to invest that in education and training, well, that is about human capital. It's about social capital. And so I think it starts to change the lens through which you view where you stand and where you want to get to. I think it can work very well in conjunction with the National Performance Framework, but it does, I think, change the way you think about your society, and that your economy, each of the pillars of economic capital are as important as each other. And that certainly historically wouldn't be the way economists look at the progress of a society or an economy. So I think there is great merit in it, and I would hope that government's acceptance that it is a good lens through which to view Scotland's progress is one that they do adopt when it matters most.
It's almost like looking at the people of Scotland and our infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, it's so, we don't ignore financial and physical infrastructure, but we do also care about natural capital. We care about human and social capital. They are so very important. If we're serious about a well-being economy, I'm afraid there is no alternative, and I think it's a very strong model. Dieter Helm has done a lot of work on this, so Dieter will no doubt give you a even more expert kind of flavour of why it matters so much. But I'm certainly very converted to its importance.
And Mark, did you have a final question for Benny Higgins?
Yeah, I mean, you've spoken a lot, Benny, about the well-being economy this morning, but I wondered where you stood on economic growth as being the main driver of society. I mean, you were quoted in the Times recently as saying you've got the ideological zealots who would throw economic growth jobs under a bus to achieve a much narrower set of objectives. So I'm wondering where you see economic growth. I mean, do you see that as part of a well-being economy, or what?
Yeah, look, to be crystal clear, I think we need to create an economy that does grow, that does create jobs, but does it in the context of a well-being economy. There are people out there who don't believe in a well-being economy. I know some of them pretty well. I don't agree with them. I think a well-being economy is something we must strive to create. But even within the broad church of people who believe in a well-being economy, there are people in different parts of that spectrum. And I know that there are some people who think that economic growth itself that jeopardises a well-being economy. I don't agree with that either. I think what we've got to do is we've got to strike the right position where we are clear that net zero by 2045 is important. We do start to measure emissions. We measure the economic progress under 4 equal measures of economic capital, the 4 I've mentioned a few times. That we are investing in sectors with conditionality, that we are creating jobs and training and education that's fit for the middle of the 21st century. And I hope that if we can take on this really difficult challenge, we can be an economy, a country, a society that has got fairness, it's got sustainability, it's got a sense of well-being, it's got less inequality. But we've done so by creating jobs, the right kinds of jobs. So I don't think we have to make a choice between the two. I think we should strive for both. I think it's doable, I think it's possible. But along the way, there will be disagreements. I mean, the interview you referred to was quite a long discussion, which in a short piece in the paper, that makes it sound slightly more stark. But all I'm saying is that I don't agree with those that don't care about it. Within those who do care about it and think well-being is important, there is a broad church, and within that broad church, I probably am not at either extreme.
Thank you, and that seems like a good point to end this. Benny Higgins, I want to thank you for your time this morning, and it certainly provided a good broad base on which to speak to our next panellists. We're going to take a 5-minute suspension to allow the panels to change. Thank you. Right, we continue now with evidence on the committee's Green Recovery Inquiry, and we have joining us Professor Dieter Helm, who is Professor of Economic Policy for the University of Oxford and the advisory group on the Economic Recovery member. Good morning, Professor Helm, and welcome to the meeting. Hopefully you've been listening to some of what we heard from the chair of the Economic Recovery Group before, and Benny Higgins mentioned quite a lot about natural capital and the role that our natural assets in Scotland play in a green recovery. Can I get your view on what role investment in our natural capital should take as we look forward to a green recovery?
Well, thank you very much for asking me to appear. Let me start off with the observation that there is no sustainable economic growth and therefore no sustainable consumption without natural capital. And in that sense, although it's one of the four capitals, if you don't have it, you don't have an economy. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that in terms of investing in natural capital, like any other form of capital, some opportunities are better than others, but there are a couple of overriding considerations. The first one is that it's absolutely critical to do the capital maintenance to ensure that the natural capital does not decline, and to focus on those bits of natural capital which are what we call renewables. That's not renewables in the sense of energy. It's the idea that these are things that nature gives us for free and will go on giving us for free for generations and generations and generations to come. So it's incredibly important that we don't extinguish these. And then within the enhancements that are available, once you've made sure that you're not letting your natural capital go backwards, what matters is finding those with the greatest benefits, all within kind of safe limits and thresholds, so you're not putting the assets at risk. And some opportunities are much better than others. If you put trees in urban areas, you'll get a lot more benefit to people than you do if you put them in the middle of the countryside. It doesn't mean that you should choose one rather than the other, but you have to think quite carefully, given that fortunately we have a limited amount of money to invest, in making sure we get the best bucks for the economy, for a sustainable economy, from what we invest in.
And how does this fit? We were talking about incentivising private investment into, say, the Scottish National Investment Bank, and it being used for long-term projects. And what you've just described, the example you've just given, very difficult for people who've got shareholders to look at something like their money going into something like that, which has got I suppose, maybe in their view, an altruistic and less of a kind of financial benefit. And how can we get the message across to private investors that investing in our natural capital is a good idea for them, when perhaps they maybe look at things in a little bit more short-term way?
Well, any business has to, in the end, make profits, otherwise it goes bust. So a business will look at the investment opportunities in front of it. And what really matters in terms of investing in natural capital is to think about the revenues. Okay, so where do you get the benefits from these investments? So give you an example. I'm in favour of a carbon price, which applies not just to emissions, but to sequestration. Remember, climate change is just the balance between two things, what we put up there and what nature takes back out. And nature has been balancing our climate for millions and millions of years. Okay? So if I put carbon back in the soil, remember soil has 4 times the carbon of the atmosphere, then I'm doing good for climate change in the same way as I'm doing good if I stop emissions from a coal power station. But no business is going to invest in this unless they get paid for it. And that's the revenue flow. Similarly, managing natural capital has great benefits to water and water supplies. Well, water is treated as free. It isn't. It requires habitat maintenance, etc. Similarly, the leisure, health, welfare benefits, mental health, physical health, Well, we spend a lot of money on these things, and it's big part of budgets. But, we actually have to make a connection between people who invest in this stuff and the spending and therefore the revenue that goes with it. So think revenue, think about the prices you have in the economy, and that's how you're going to get the private sector to invest, rather than try to pretend that, let's ask them to be altruistic. Unfortunately, you don't keep a business working by being altruistic. You have to make a profit. And nature should be able to provide profit like any other investment. And it's because the prices are wrong and the revenues are wrong that we're getting inferior, non-sustainable economic growth.
So the real role here is for the government to step in and incentivise or otherwise that kind of an investment into that. And did you see that as being the main driver in making private companies actually do the right thing? Or do you think there's other roles, like, for example, their public relations in regards to how they invest their money?
Well, PR is a gloss on top. But if you don't get the fundamentals of business right, this is going to be a nice to have when you haven't had a coronavirus and your business isn't in difficulty. Okay? And we can't go on treating the environment like a luxury good and hope people are just going to be nice about it. We have to get it into the heart of the economy. Now, fundamentally, that's about incentivizing the right sort of behavior and penalizing the wrong. So a carbon price does exactly this. Why would a carbon price make it profitable to invest in nature recovery, in soils and in peat, on the one hand, and make it not very attractive to burn coal? Well, because the externality, the pollution, is being paid for. And that's the essence of the idea that the polluter pays. And if you don't have the polluter pays, if you subsidize the polluters, and we do quite a lot of that in agriculture, for example, you will get damage to natural capital and you will undermine your sustainable economic growth.
So there's quite a few vehicles that can be used by the Scottish Government in order to do that, but there's quite a lot of vehicles that lie at the door of the UK Government as well. Focusing on the Scottish Government vehicles, where do you think, and obviously we just had the programme for government, where do you think are the most effective vehicles for doing what you have just said?
Scotland has control of its agriculture, as I understand it, and the Common Agricultural Policy is one of the most destructive environmental policies that have ever been invented. It encourages people to do things to our soils and indeed our peat over the last 40 years in which we've been in it, which have done very serious damage to our natural capital and been net economic losses for the Scottish economy overall, not just for the future generations, but for the current one. So that's a good place to start. Land use is really, all the issues around land are very much, as I understand it, in Scotland's hands. In energy, Scotland, there's some dispute about precisely where the boundaries lie, as I understand it, between the UK government and the Scottish government as to exactly where the discretions lie. But there's no doubt whatsoever that Scotland's perfectly capable of pursuing an energy policy which is consistent with addressing climate change and doing it in a holistic, Scottish-wide sequestration as well as emissions form. So that's two big starting points, and then you get on to the mental and physical health. And again, Scotland has considerable control over health and how the health budgets are spent. Local government budgets, what you do with local parks, what you do with green spaces, whether you let kids have access to green close to, what you do with urban biodiversity, what you do with water. I mean, the scope is enormous. I'd worry less about how much you've got control over and more about making at least some of these bits work a lot better than they currently do.
Okay, to drill down a little bit more on the sort of action in this regard, I'm going to pass over to Finlay Carson.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us. You'll be aware that the Oxford Review of Economic Policy said that natural capital is one of the highest scoring economic recovery policies, and the AGER report also points out that the significant comparative advantage for Scotland because of its natural capital. Do you believe that the Scottish Government's use of the four capitals approach can maximise the natural capital that we've got, and can you see such approach actually delivering action on the ground?
So the first thing to say is that I struggle to think of anywhere in the world where natural capital is more important to the economy than Scotland. I mean, right from its just sheer beauty to its hospitality sector, to its natural resources, to its wind opportunities, to the marine side. I mean, you know, if you don't have a serious natural capital policy in Scotland and you don't invest in it, you know, there ain't much hope for creating a long-term sustainable economy in Scotland. So, I mean, the scope and opportunities here are just massive. Now, the four capitals approach. Okay, so I'm very happy that all four capitals are taken into account. They all matter. A sort of nuance of difference, I would add, is that the implication is that you can trade one off against the other. Okay, as I sometimes say to my students, you know, do you think that if we have less swallows turning up, it's okay because we've got more iPhones, right? You can just trade off the natural world with the manufactured physical capital, etc. My view is no. There are some trade-offs you can make, but they're a lot more difficult than people imagine. And actually, natural capital needs to be pursued in its own right. And I give you a little example. You know, I spent a lot of time in the Outer Hebrides. I love it. And I look at the development of fish farms and the new industries being created around that. And it's not hard to see that there are trade-offs. You know, you can't do development of large-scale fish farming without some environmental consequence. Okay, so what really matters is on the ground the practicalities of where can trade-offs be legitimately made and where can't they. And for a country that depends so much on natural capital, you know, you lose your natural capital at Scotland's peril, because to be blunt, if you don't have that, you've got a huge hole in your potential economy.
That leads perfectly into my next question. I'm concerned, particularly at my part of the country is Dumfries and Galloway. We have one of the most deforested areas in the UK, and Scotland has plans, and they're very ambitious plans, and I welcome the plans for a big increase in the number of trees we plant. But can I ask you, with a view to the short-term benefits as opposed to the longer-term sustainability of land use policies, what work needs to be done to better measure and monitor Scotland's natural assets? And is there any particular area which you think should be given priority or prioritised with regards to moving towards net zero? And I'm probably pushing you towards the land use type of response to this question.
Okay, so let me unpack it in its various bits. Okay, the first thing to say is, it's a sort of trivial point, but it's true, is you can't work out how you can improve things unless you know what you've got in the first place. Okay, so I'm in favour of a baseline natural capital survey, a census for the whole of Scotland. It's like a doomsday book. It was done in the 1930s by Dudley Stamp for the UK in parts, and getting all the school kids and everyone else involved in finding out what's out there using the latest satellite data. And quite a lot of this has been done in Scotland, but actually this needs to be brought together. Let's have a census of what we've got. Okay, and some of it's in good shape and some of it isn't. As the great Fraser Darling, a brilliant scientist, wrote about Scotland after the war, quite a lot of it is a brown, wet desert, because it suffered from actually centuries of overgrazing by sheep and then overgrazing by deer, etc. going forward. So some of it's not in a good shape, some of it's better. But let's start off by working out what we've got. When you know what you've got, you can then start to work out in measurement terms what the possible enhancements are, And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to write down the opportunities that are out there in the land use. To be blunt, and you may think I'm being extreme, but it's quite hard to do it worse. But that's also true in England and Wales as well, and quite a lot of Europe. So the scope for improvement is enormous. Now, that comes back to the earlier question about, well, which investments should we make? And part of that is, well, where are the returns? And one of the great returns to the land in Scotland is being paid for carbon sequestrated and being taxed for carbon emitted, to change the nature of how the land is used. And you'll have to do that to get to net zero by 2050, let alone by an earlier target. It's essential that agriculture and indeed transport are part of this frame. And so you start to look at those opportunities, and some of them are going to be about native woodland, some of them are going to be about preservation and capital maintenance for peat. You have some of the greatest peat deposits in the world, and some of it's going to be about putting carbon back in soils. None of it's rocket science. The baseline works out where the enhancements are developed from, and that enables private markets to develop and public markets in paying for the carbon offsets that sequestration can deliver.
Just very, very briefly, do you think we're doing enough right now? So we've got a plan to plant an extra 20,000 hectares of trees, and 75% of those are likely to be Sitka spruce. Are we doing enough at the moment to look at the qualities of soil when it comes to storing carbon, as opposed to what's above the ground with Sitka or broadleaf? Does that work need to be done right now, rather than just racing ahead and planting potentially, 15,000 hectares of Sitka spruce across Scotland?
Yeah, so there's a real risk that what happens to the land is that everything is about climate change. Everything is about sequestrating as fast as possible, and therefore you cover the land in the fastest growing trees you can possibly think of, and you might throw in eucalyptus trees in as well if you want to do that. The way you have to think about the land and natural capital is that it produces multiple outcomes. Okay, so you can look at some of the acidification of upland rivers in Scotland caused by the great plantations, when the emphasis was produce timber, 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 and don't worry about anything else. So I think it's absolutely crucial, to put it in a simplistic way, that you put the right trees in the right place. And spruce has its role, but it's pretty limited, and it can be devastating for some of the other natural capital benefits that you also want to bring into account. I mean, it's like good farming. You don't have a single idea about a farm is a piece of blotting paper to produce just one crop. You think about the management of those soils, that's its natural capital for any farm. You think about how to manage them. So I think it's incredibly dangerous to just rush out and plant as many trees as possible and have governments setting targets for how many thousands of trees are planted each week or each year. What we need is a clear and sensible natural capital plan for Scotland, and we work out where the trees go. Now, let me add one final thing. You could really do some damage, climate change, if you start sticking trees on peat and the peat dries out. You could have much more emissions from the peat than the trees could ever sequestrate from the environment. So a little less haste. I mean, it's not about taking years to think about these things, but whether you plant the tree tomorrow morning or in 2 years' time will not make much difference to climate change, but it could make a hell of a lot of difference, if I could put it that way, to water quality, biodiversity, nature benefits to people, all the other natural capital benefits. And that's what the baseline's about. You get a baseline, you then work out the enhancement, you simulate the baseline as if the enhancement has happened, and then you compare the natural capital benefits before you did the enhancement with those afterwards. Then you time to the revenue and off you go. And that's, if you like, a much more kind of rigorous mainstream way of thinking about our environment, bringing it into the heart of the economy and not just some luxury add-on.
Can I bring in Liz Smith?
Thank you very much. You mentioned earlier about externalities, and bad externalities when it's a case of pollution and the polluter pays, etc. There are some good externalities, and of course one of these is education, in terms of not just benefiting the person who is experiencing the education, but society benefits too. Could I ask you, in your opinion, do you think we are sufficiently well educated when it comes to harnessing both the public and the private sector's joint approach to shoring up the rural economy? Because I think it's an issue that's coming through quite a lot of the evidence to this committee.
So most populations, at least in the developed world, now live in cities, and their contact with the natural world is quite often just virtual, but it's very, very limited. You know, kids don't know where the food comes from. People see a green, vivid field and think that's a really good piece of biodiversity, where it might just be intensive nitrates producing the outcome. So knowledge is a good thing. How could I, as a university professor, ever suggest that we don't need more education about the countryside? But I think it's a bit more engaged than that. So while you need, you know, university expertise, genetics, all that kind of stuff, it's at the other end of the scale that the engagement with nature starts, and it produces benefits to people going forward. Now we now know in quite considerable detail exactly what green does to the mental facilities of every human being. You know, we can even tell by measuring what goes on in the brain what different shades of green do to mental well-being. Okay, now think of those kids. You know, the difference between having in the middle of Glasgow, having a quick access to a green bit of space to play in or not. You know, just a corner. Just think about what's happened in the schools, the absence of any kind of, you know, vegetable plot or anything. And these things are not only pretty cheap, but the scale of the benefits is massively under-measured. Right? And we need to look to that. I mean, if you go back, I was watching, I think Scottish TV is great. So I was watching a programme a while back about organisations that used to take inner city Glasgow kids and take them for a month up into the hills and in the summer and give them experience of the outdoors. Change their lives. Okay? And this isn't sort of nice romantic stuff. This is about real economics, because ultimately the economy is there to address us as people. And if we don't have the mental well-being, wherewithal, and we don't have the experiences of nature, how can we get the benefits that are just so great for all of us? So, yeah, and in this sense, you know, when we talk about the four capitals, of course, human capital is complementary to natural capital. It's not a trade-off. You need both. You know, I'm just staggered. I had a student recently, I mentioned this thing about swallows and iPhones, and they said, "What's a swallow?" And I thought to myself, you've never seen a swallow, have you? You've never seen the wonder of that. It's completely missing from your experience. What a tragedy.
And very quickly, just one follow-up question. Would you imagine that this would have to be part of the measurement when it comes to a census of natural capital?
When you say which bit of the measurement do you mean? Can you just clarify?
What you've just said regarding the fact that, you know, when it comes to youngsters' education, about their activity within the natural world, do you believe that that should be part of the natural census when we're looking at what we actually have? And you referred earlier about the starting point. We need to know what the starting point is and to move on. Should that be part of it?
Okay, so let me be slightly tediously technical. Okay, so natural capital is a set of assets. Those assets have flows, which are the benefits we get from them. Okay, my starting point is to know what's on the balance sheet. I want to know what Scotland's national balance sheet looks like, and I want to know what all the four types of assets or capitals are on that balance sheet. Now, here's the difference between myself and many economists. I'm not a utilitarian. I don't think that it's simply a question of looking at how much pleasure or pain we get from different assets and saying that's the value of them. The reason natural capital is an asset distinct from the flows, though related to the flows, is I think the objective is to provide future generations, any generation, with a set of assets so they can choose how they want to live their lives, rather than simply short-term try to make them happy. Okay, so I start with the assets. That will be a great base. Of course, I want to know about the flows, and I'd like to measure those too. But we don't have either. And so I do the first bit first, and then I add the second bit second. And when I look at the enhancements, and say, what are the benefits from making this asset a bit better? So, for example, enable people to use it, etc. That's when I want to know how many people could use this asset and how much pleasure they will get from doing it. But first assets, then flows.
Can I bring in Stuart Stevenson?
Thank you, Convener. Since we're talking about natural assets, I'm minded to look at the 1424 Royal Mines Act, which the Scottish Parliament passed, which disconnects from the ownership of land the right to gold and silver that might be found in the land. So there's a precedent for disconnecting some of the assets from land from your ownership for a broad range of purposes. So in relation to natural capital, who should own the capital? Should it be the state or should it be the individual landowner? And if it's the state, where do the liabilities and contingent liabilities that might be associated with owning that natural capital therefore lie? Should they travel with the ownership or should they stay with the owner? Now, I think I'm looking for a short answer, even though I suspect there's a PhD thesis in the real answer.
Well, the first short answer is I'm not familiar with medieval Scottish law, so I can't comment on that. The second short answer is, most economists kind of a bit indifferent about who owns things. They're just property rights. Okay, so if you look at the mix between state and private, in lots of countries, it differs a lot. So, for example, in the UK, and I'm not entirely familiar how it relates to Scotland, the seabed is owned by the Crown Estate, and a lot of mineral assets belong to the state. In the United States, what's underground belongs to the landowner. That's why, for example, Shell Oil's developed some shale gas so quickly in the United States, because you can grab what's underneath. In the UK, if you want to build a wind farm offshore, you have to buy the rights from the state. I can't get terribly excited about which of those works best. I think it's always going to be a mess of history, inheritance from the past, culture, etc. And right now, I'm much more interested in the incentives that either party face than particularly being enthusiastic about changing it in either direction. But it's not, for me, the main issue.
Right. Okay. Let me move on to a matter of a bit more substance, perhaps, than the esoteric history of some of our land ownership. We've talked a lot in the last few minutes here about land-based natural assets, but of course the area of sea that lies within Scottish waters is very substantially greater than our land base. So what are the different roles that the sea, both the water, but also what's under the water and who lives in the water, should play in supporting the necessary shifts? Where does the balance lie, and what are the particular considerations that are derived from our aquatic world?
Okay, so I don't see any difference. The principles are the same. The natural capital should be assessed. You need a baseline to know what's there. And some of that natural capital is what I call renewables. So it could be there not just for you to enjoy, but subsequent generations. And some of it's one-off. So take an example. Take North Sea oil and gas. Okay? So that's one-off. It's non-renewable. Someone used it once and that's it. So the important thing there is to make sure that if this generation uses it, they give compensation to future generations who won't have it. That's what Norway does. That's why you should have a sovereign wealth fund in oil, okay, and gas. And one of the tragedies in the UK is we don't. We've consumed it all. We've had lower taxes than we otherwise would have had. My generation's had a party on the basis of North Sea oil and gas. It's all over now and there's nothing left for the future. That's a non-renewable. But there are renewables out there. So take fish. So Scotland used to be a prime place for the herring fisheries. You go around to Leverburgh in Harris, you can see right round the coast, the Summer Isles, you know, the herring industry was there. If you husband your fish stock properly, they'll be there in 100,000 years' time for people to benefit from. The economic value is huge of maintaining them above the threshold. If you trash them, then it's all gone, and it's not just gone for you and me, it's gone for every generation to come in the future. So the balance between renewables and non-renewables in the natural capital sense turns out to be particularly pertinent for offshore. It's the same principle, but it's very much to the fore. And that's what fisheries policy is about. That's what depletion of mineral resources offshore is about. And I have to say, and it's no criticism of Scotland in particular, it's a criticism actually quite general, but particularly for the UK as a whole, it's been done incredibly badly. That's where we are. But the upside of that is, think of the scope for improvement. Think how much better it could be. And think about the returns that come from doing it in a more focused way. And that's why I want to stress the investment opportunities offshore are every bit as good as the investment opportunities onshore.
Thank you for that. I would say, of course, the caverns that are now empty of oil are an asset in that we can store carbonic acid there, which would be a positive contributor to the agenda. And indeed, to the extent that we could import that carbonic acid from other countries who do not have that storage. But that's for another day. Oh, and Leverburgh also, of course, was a place where iodine was produced for a while from seaweed. So there are many natural assets. But how really are we going to find some new innovation? Because we're kind of talking about objectives, and what I'm interested in is means as well as objective. What barriers are there to turning these green assets into something that can realistically make the kind of contributions that we want to see being made? What are the barriers, and what role can the government play in deconstructing these barriers? Obviously the Scottish Government, but I'm interested in government generally.
Okay, so you weren't expecting an economist to reply by saying, get the prices right. So if you don't have a price for stuff, nobody can exploit it. It's back to the question at the beginning of this session about, how can the private sector take up these opportunities? Now, if you think about particular examples, so all those empty oil and gas wells offshore and the pipelines that go with it. Well, CCS may or may not be a significant part of addressing climate change. And I think the jury's still out on hydrogen, by the way. But it may be, may not be. But, nobody's going to do CCS unless the policy provides an economic incentive to do it, unless the government wants to do it off its own back. So what do you need? Well, first of all, if you pay a carbon pollution tax, you'll be much keener to bury the stuff in the ground so you don't pay the tax. That's the first thing that's pretty straightforward. You need, in addition, to make sure you've got the licensing and the regulations around it sorted. And you will need some human capital skills. So you need to think about how you're going to invest in Aberdeen in the new skills of carbon sequestration and so on, in the way that Aberdeen has been investing in offshore wind and so on and so forth. So there's some pretty straightforward things to do there. But the other side of it is stop paying people to do bad things. Okay, and that's what the Common Agricultural Policy does. Actually, it's worse than that. It pays people to own land. I mean, it's very, very hard to think of why you would pay someone public money for a private benefit, the private benefit of which is the occupation of the land. It's extraordinary. So, we spend quite a lot on the environment, but if you did an audit of the totality of spending on the land in Scotland and asked yourself, is it conceivable you could get less environmental and natural capital benefits the amount you spend than you currently do? I think that'll be an interesting and challenging intellectual exercise, right? So we can do much better. So let's spend the money wisely. Let's make sure that, since government sets, most of the income for most farmers anyway, since government sets the framework around the incentives for CCS, etc. These are examples where the private sector can take things up. And if you take the great success of wind in Scotland, it's the private sector that's done all that. Why? Because there have been contracts in place and a market to do it. And hey, presto, the private sector reacts really quickly to these opportunities. But if you don't have the prices right, if you don't pay people to provide the things that you want paid, and you don't penalise them for the pollution, you won't get there. And I think that's, I find there's great grounds for optimism. Just moving in this direction, there's enormous potential for Scotland, and it's because Scotland is overwhelmingly a natural capital economy.
Mark Ruskell, you wanted to come in briefly on this issue. So that you
I just wondered if you had thoughts on how quickly we should be depleting our resources of oil and gas. I mean, you mentioned there about intergenerational equity, but the current trajectory is that we consume North Sea oil and gas reserves in this generation, and that's it. What would you say about the wisdom of that from a natural capital perspective?
The probability is, in fact, the certainty is, that the world has vastly more oil and gas than it could possibly burn without frying the planet many times over. We went through all that nonsense about peak oil and we're going to run out the stuff. If only, okay? We've got bucket loads of the stuff globally, and the cheapest place to produce it is Saudi Arabia, where it costs about $5 a barrel or less to produce it, whereas in the North Sea, it costs quite a lot more. Okay? So we're talking about an industry that's going to decline. And if we do address climate change properly, by 2040, 2050, we ain't going to want so much of it, and we certainly aren't going to want the most expensive stuff. We're going to drive back the production to the cheap sources. So Scotland's North Sea oil and gas only worked because OPEC doubled and then quadrupled the price of oil in the 1970s. It wasn't economic in the 60s, and it isn't economic at the marginal cost of oil in the Middle East. It's just the OPEC monopoly that keeps the North Sea in business. So the first thing you have to do is a practical point. Your oil's going to be worth less tomorrow than it is today. The second thing is somebody's going to produce the oil. Some oil is going to be burnt, whether one likes it or not, whether one prefers it to be the case. And over the next 10, 20 years, people are still going to be driving around in petrol and diesel driven cars, and a huge amount of the world economy is still going to be based on oil and gas. So that's a choice. But if it was my assets, I think, and wrote a book about this called The Burnout, and my view is the oil price is going to gradually fall over time, and therefore your assets going to be diminishing over time. So that's my take on that. The separate issue is, should you, even at this late stage, be putting aside some of the money from the final depletion of this for future generations? Well, you should, but my guess is going to cost you so much to clean up the mess that's left anyway that you probably don't even have enough money to do that. And therefore, sadly, the opportunity has passed.
Can I go to questions from Angus MacDonald, please?
Okay, thanks, Convener. Can I just say at the outset that hailing from the Outer Hebrides, quite enjoying the wee asides regarding Leverborough, etc. Anyway, I have a specific question with regard to the Scottish Wildlife Trust's submission to AGER on the concept of conservation finance. The SWT suggested an initial investment of £1 million to help accelerate private investment, facilitate innovation, promote good governance, support the development of common metrics and scale up knowledge exchange. So I wonder if you have a view on the proposed development of a conservation finance fund.
Well, this needs to be split up into its various component parts, and people confuse finance with funds. So a while ago I proposed that there would be a national nature fund, but what I had in mind was not finance, I had fund. Into that would go the pollution taxes and a series of revenues, including from carbon and elsewhere, to provide the basis for then spending that money in the normal way of government brings in money and then pays it out on an ongoing revenue basis. Now, a separate question is whether there should be a finance facility to borrow money to make these investments. And then you have to ask some practical questions. Why doesn't the private sector do that? That's what it does to build a wind farm. It looks at the economic returns of the wind farm, borrows the money and makes a profit because it thinks it's a net present value positive project. So the question is what's being proposed really more public expenditure on projects which would not otherwise be economic to the private sector? Or is it some kind of green finance? And I'm not against any of that, but I think you want to ask the serious question about green finance. It's not about whether you can borrow money. It's what the revenue is going to be to pay the interest and pay it back at the end of the game. The finance is just a means to an end, but fundamentally, you have to ask yourself whether these investments are public or private, and whether they're going to be made out of taxpayers' money or ultimately the payers of the revenue flows which come from the public good natural capital assets that are created. So I think I like the aspiration, and it's a nice round number, and it galvanizes opinion. But I would like to be absolutely clear what it's for, what the revenue flows are, and which investments are going to be made to deliver those outcomes. And in all of this, capital maintenance is what comes first. And in some areas that's very expensive, in other areas it's not.
Okay, thank you.
Finlay Carson had a quick supplementary to this.
Just going back, we're again talking about the natural capital and whatever. We don't have the baseline information. This committee took evidence, I think it's probably 2 years ago, about the lack of a proper database in the simplest form for biodiversity and natural capital. Where should the funding for that come from? Does there need to be some sort of public sector pump priming to set this up so we know where we're starting from and what that potential capital flow from it can be?
I think this should be a public enterprise, and I think it should create a database which should be available to everyone. And I regard that as kind of the essential public good that the state can provide to everybody in the society, whether they be individuals, charities, companies, etc. It's a bit like the Ordnance Survey, right? Okay. The second thing is it's not massively expensive. Right? The satellite data, I think I can tell you on what's on every square 20 metres of Scotland, right? With some considerable resolution now. Okay, and that comes back to the final point. Let's get it roughly right rather than be precisely wrong. Let's get started. Okay, we can always make it more sophisticated later. We can add lots more data. But if you start from precisely the wrong position, you don't have the baseline. Trying to work out, we can't do this, it's too expensive, it's got to be perfect, this is the kind of, you can't tell exactly what's 4 inches under the soil in a particular location, etc. Well, no, we can't. But I would like to know something about it first. So I want a rough map. I want to know roughly where the Outer Hebrides are. And then I'd really like to know precisely where Kirkybost is, where Valley Sands are, and exactly where the fish farm is located in a particular occasion, and what the entrance to Tarbert looks like. Okay, so start general. Let's get a big picture of what Scotland looks like, the main natural capital assets, and then let's drill down. And this is a permanent activity, and you need an environmental analysis statistical unit in government to do this in the same way as you need data about where the roads are. Just do it, and if you've only got X to spend on it, well, let's work out how to spend X well, and then we can work out whether there's a good case to spend Y.
I'd like to bring in Mark for her final question around business support and other incentives and disincentives for companies to do the right thing when it comes to a net zero goal. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Kavina. It's really a question about when government is supporting business, how do we ensure that the policy is coherent You know, a lot of environmental NGOs tell us they've got concerns about, you know, government policy support for one sector taking us perhaps, you know, more towards net zero, but support for another sector may be taking us in another direction. So how do we ensure that there's that policy coherence across government, so we're meeting the objectives of net zero and other objectives of a well-being economy as well? Because it seems that there can be contradictions in the way that governments operate and the kind of support that they give to industry.
Never cease to be amazed at the capacity of governments to hold two mutually inconsistent views simultaneously and pursue two mutually inconsistent policies at the same time. Okay, so that's in the nature of government and politics and so on. So what one's trying to do is provide some coherence. Okay, so for me, the starting point is a carbon price which applies to everything and every activity in the economy. So transport is not treated differently from electricity, and neither is agriculture. You can't get agriculture going in sequestrating carbon and paying people to do that unless there's a price of carbon, and it should be the same throughout. That's the single most important thing, and I'd apply it to imports to make sure that Scotland does not achieve its net zero target by closing down as much of its energy intensive industry as possible and import the stuff instead, which is what's been going on in Europe and in the UK, and dare I say it's what my new net zero book is all about. You have to do it on a coherent carbon consumption basis. The second thing you have to do is you have to provide the public goods, the infrastructures, the networks within which the private sector functions. And this isn't just about, you know, there being electricity cables and so on around the place, and of course fibre, which is crucial to all of these networks. It's also about the other forms of public good. So the question just asked me about how to do the baseline sensors. That's a public good to any business to incentivize them to understand what they've got, to provide them the data in the same way as you might go and turn to the Ordnance Survey to get a picture of what you've got in place. But it's also about knowledge. It's about providing the framework for business to have suitably knowledgeable and qualified young people to go into these activities, because if you don't understand what it is that you're trying to do, you're not going to make a lot of progress. And in an aging population, particularly an aging agricultural population, it is very, very important to have a strong flow of young, educated people knowledgeable in the world of natural capital, so that we move from the world that most farmers have known since the Second World War to a world in which we're dealing with digital technologies, everything from, you know, vertical farmers at the Hutton Institute, absolutely brilliant research programs going on there. These are where part of that knowledge comes from. So you have to put all this together, and it's just good government, a framework, good things that government can do, public goods, infrastructures, private sector, prices, of all of which the carbon price on carbon consumption is the most important single item to get the coherence that you mentioned in your question.
Right, we have run out of time, and I know that Professor Helm does have to be away by 11, so we are going to have to end it there. I want to thank you very much for coming before our committee once again, Professor Helm. We're going to suspend briefly to allow a change in panel. Thank you. Welcome back to our committee meeting in which we look at the green recovery, and we have the third panellist today joining us, Professor Dave Ray, who's the Chair in Carbon Management and Education, School of Geosciences at the University of Edinburgh and Executive Director of ECCI. Good morning, Professor Ray, nice to see you again. I'd like to turn to the programme for government in particular and ask your views on whether anything in that programme for government with regards to the terrestrial and marine environments and any related industries contributes to a green recovery, if that has actually been evident in anything you've read from the programme for government.
Yeah, I was quite impressed with the clear commitment for tree planting, so forestry grant scheme, just in terms of the assurance that gives the industry and landowners in terms of the tree planting targets and increasing those. One of the really nice things actually in there was not just about tree planting, but about the nurseries, so providing the trees that we need to plant. And I suppose that kind of systems view in terms of green recovery, of looking, if we just take trees, thinking about the nurseries, the tree planting, but also things like the timber industry. So linking those things up is really, really good to see. On the marine side, so there's the new, Blue Economy Action Plan, which looks great. I mean, it's such a key part for us, I think, in terms of, because it's such a large area and the potential there is huge in terms of job creation and linking in with our climate change and biodiversity targets. I think there's a real role particularly there for more research, so that's certainly something which was welcome. I suppose the thing that always rankles with me, because I'm impatient, is around agriculture. So in terms of the programme for government, obviously there was talk of the land use strategy coming through, so that the update to that next year, which is great, and talk about the plans for agriculture in terms of post-cap support and aligning that with net zero. But there's no detail. There's still no detail in terms of when we can get pilots going. There are various proposals flying around in terms of what a new rural support regime might look like and how that might align with net zero and green recovery. But yeah, the detail wasn't there, and I suppose that's just a personal frustration for me, is that the 2024 is coming up fast. We've also got the issue of Brexit at the end of this year and the impact that could have on the industry. So yeah, I was generally impressed, but for a few areas, there's still a lot of details come through.
Now I'm going to pass on to Finlay Carson, who's going to ask you directly about agricultural policy and what you'd see. In terms of generally, was there anything else that you were looking for that wasn't included that you think could have been included this time round?
I suppose going back to the positives, so green skills were in there, and that was great. One of the things that we were pushing for through the Climate Emergency Response Group was actually an overt ask from government through the programme for government for this year coming up to work with higher and further education and other educational providers to really look at our provision. So actually making that overt and saying, right, we're in this green recovery, particularly for young people, the kind of the risks are huge, and we're in the front line as education providers of hopefully buffering that, giving them opportunities, linking that up with new jobs that will be created. And so looking at that alignment, I think is really urgent. It's something that is mentioned. I mean, obviously there's the climate emergency skills action plan that Skills Development Scotland are leading on, and that's great. But again, it's my own area, so you look for your own area, and I was hoping for something quite strong on that, and hopefully that will materialise. But yeah, it was a long PFG anyway, but I would have liked to see a bit more there.
Okay, thank you. As promised, I'll pass over to Finlay Carson.
Good morning, Professor Ray. it's interesting that you say that you're impatient for change, and there's many disappointed that we don't have a clearer path to how rural support in Scotland might look, and how that'll tie in with environment. But on the same basis that you say you're impatient, I've also read your paper on the pitfalls and precautions on the road to net zero, and so there's obviously needs to be quite some emphasis put on research. So with that in mind, what 3 changes in agriculture or rural policies do you think right now offer the best opportunities to support a green recovery?
Yes, I suppose, one is kind of a flippant one, which is not to separate them. So rural and agriculture, actually, those policies, they should be integrated. And so that's one of the things. Hopefully our land use strategy, when that comes through, will help address that. So that would be, I guess, a high level one. Another one would be basic payment scheme. So just in terms of the transition period we've got, so 4 years, actually trying stuff out. So running pilots where we're looking at the trajectory for agriculture and land use in Scotland and its alignment with net zero, and actually looking at trialling new payment systems. So it might be, again, the green strings attached to basic payment, trying that out so we can see how then it could be rolled out nationwide, and so we don't hit 2024 and still don't really know, and still kind of fall back on, well, there's too many questions, we still need research, and so we just continue with essentially business as usual, which for our sector, for agriculture and wider land use, we can't afford that for net zero. So that would be my second one. The third one comes back to the capacity building and a mindset change. So really around, and that feeds into the second one really, just in terms of, have we got the capacity in terms of our advisory services, in terms of the land users themselves, to implement the new management strategies, the new technologies, the new rural support system? Do we have that change in mindset, which is instead of a basic payment that we get, actually, if we're still getting that kind of support, actually, what is the return on investment for the public? That mindset needs to come through really strongly, and obviously, again, I'm biased on this, but I think that capacity building through education across the rural sector would be a big one for me. So policies around enhancing the advisory support services, but also and the consultancies, but actually, the kind of advice they're giving around alignment with net zero and green recovery.
Thank you. We heard earlier and a question asked Professor Helm about baseline informations and pulling that together. But let's say we have that information and it's built up. We get the government committing to funding that baselining to be done properly. What indicators then would you be looking for which would signal that some of the pilots or the projects that you've suggested we need to introduce actually are showing that Scotland's on its route to a green recovery?
Yeah, that's it. So I'm a carbon geek, which is one of the problems that I have. So I just look at emissions. So I'd be looking at how we're doing on our emissions. And as a sector for agriculture, obviously we're lagging behind some of the other big sectors, particularly energy. And as part of that, our proportion of Scotland's emissions gets bigger and bigger by the year. So I'll be looking at that. I guess on pilot scales, then you're looking as part of those pilots at the monitoring, reporting and verification framework, which goes with everything from the soil carbon. That takes a long time to pick up, to detect an improvement there. But we should be getting those baseline data and then checking progress against it. Obviously, a lot of our changes would be around the direct changes in management, either whether it's arable or livestock, where you're looking at are we getting outcomes there which are detectable in terms of reduced methane emissions, reduced nitrous oxide emissions. Again, under the pilot schemes, we can actually prove those concepts. We've got a good research base. But that's where I'd be looking for the pilots to give us real assurance that if we've got a menu of options, say, for new rural support, new agricultural support that we know they're going to deliver. And that's why we need to, yes, we've got some great research going on, and we've got our research farms where we can do this in small scale, but actually trying it out on a larger scale for a pilot with farmers who are dealing with the real day-to-day issues of farming. That is actually one of the big MRV results that we need by 2024.
Thank you.
Thanks, Finlay. And can I come to Claudia Beamish?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Professor Ray. There have been many within the Parliament and beyond who've long argued for the land use strategy being on a statutory basis, and we were very interested to see your proposal for a land use bill, and of course the Climate Change Act referred through amendments to the land use strategy as well. So could you expand on that proposal, and if you think that whether you think that the proposal in the programme for government for a refresh of the land use strategy might not go far enough? What duties and powers would you like to see in such a bill, and what budget implications would this have? So I've put it all in a one-er, but if you expand on it in the way that you...
Yes, so I'm a great fan of the land use strategy. It was groundbreaking when it was developed, and a refresh is great. Why I feel it needs more than that, it needs kind of a statutory basis, is because we've had a land use strategy which in 2015 kind of seemed to sit on a virtual or physical shelf and gather dust. And that's my fear with an update, is that it'll have some good stuff in there, but we haven't got time to lose in terms of land use in Scotland and alignment with net zero and green recovery. So I think a key part of what the land use strategy already proposes are the regional land use partnerships, putting them on a statutory basis, so there's that I suppose mechanism for delivery, which is, it gives that conduit between central government and local government. I mean, the way I'm envisaging it working is, if it's at a catchment scale, that actually the local authorities that coincide with that catchment are a key kind of delivery mechanism for things like a new rural support regime. So able to translate that into something which is regionally appropriate, to ensure that the data flows. So going back to Finlay's question, in terms of the monitoring, reporting and verification, that needs to flow back in terms of to central government to actually see how well we are doing, and give them a mechanism to say, okay, within our climate targets, the biodiversity targets, how are we doing nationally? And then setting those boundaries so within the regions that can be a dynamic process, because some regions will do great in terms of making it work and going ahead on, say, carbon sequestration. Others will take a different route, and that's fine because it's regionally appropriate, but it needs to add up still to us hitting net zero by 2045 and the 2030 target, actually, which is even more testing, I would suggest, particularly in the current context. So yeah, I would really, I suppose the fundamental for me goes back right to that separating agriculture and rural, or agriculture and land use, is for me an artificial thing. It's how we report our emissions. Certainly we report land use and we report agriculture. It's a real frustration for farmers that, if we plant trees, that's not reflected in our emissions in terms of how we report them. But likewise, if we lose a load of soil carbon through land use change, that's not counted in terms of what comes back to us. And actually, agriculture is part of our rural environment in Scotland. Agriculture is land use, and so a land use bill actually which gives that integration, looks at planning, it looks at forestry, it looks at estate management as well as agriculture, because all of these things will either deliver on addressing climate and biodiversity emergency, or they'll mean we'll fail. So that integration for me is really important, and giving it the statutory basis, I think, is because it's so important, is a must. You're on mute, Claudia.
Already. Oh.
Start again, Claudia. I think we were a wee bit slow to get your mic up.
Just briefly, and there may well be others that want to come in. Do you see that the pilots, such as the Tweed and you'll remember where it is, and it's gone from my mind, but there are 2 pilots already. Is that working satisfactorily? Are those working satisfactorily? I'm not quite sure how you were delineating how local authorities would be involved as well in proposals. So could you just comment on both those things, please?
Yeah. So the 2 pilots were very different in their nature. Just in terms of the one in Aberdeenshire was very much focused on the land capability for tree planting, and that was a great exercise. Just in terms of, this is going back to the discussion you had with Dieter Helm, actually, in terms of where you put trees in the right place and what kind of trees you put there, which was really valuable. And James Hutton are still leading the way, actually, in terms of that land capability assessment. What are the physical characteristics which mean that you'll get a good return on investment in terms of carbon? I think the Borders one was more valuable in terms of the wider context, because both of them flagged up how important that regional basis is, and that I guess that communication with the community, and the community, those stakeholders aren't just farmers, they're everyone in those rural environments. And that was probably its biggest success, was actually having some quite energetic individuals and groups involved to actually make those linkages. So I think in terms of what the Land Commission are looking at, obviously they've looked at those pilots and they've done a consultation that's still ongoing in terms of how this will work. How I like the catchment idea, because catchments as a parcel give you something which is coherent in terms of what's going on in terms of water quality, obviously, but also just in terms of they often coincide with the suite of land use management that you might want to change. And obviously that doesn't always map on to local authorities. So how you would then work it, I still think local authorities would play a key role here, particularly in terms of that integration with planning and with those communities. But you might end up with some catchments where you've got quite a few local authorities which are involved, and local authorities which might span several catchments. So that, I haven't got an answer to that in terms of how you'd make it work, but I like the catchment scale. And then, we couldn't afford to ignore the local authorities as part of that. So that's hopefully the Land Commission can come up with a great answer on that.
Thank you very much.
Mark, you had a question along these lines.
Yeah, I'm drawn to the idea of catchment level action and partnerships and everything else. But do you think there are lessons to be learned there from the Flood Management Act? Because while there are some good voluntary partnerships that have been put in place to do natural flood management, for example, there are some areas where landowners are just not interested. So the question is, like, where does the compulsion sit within this? Some of this is about carrot, but some of this has to be about, national coordination and clear societal objectives. So what do you see as the role of agencies within that? Who's going to come in with a stick, basically?
Yeah, so this is, I guess where I see a key role for these regional land use partnerships is actually in that new rural support regime, so particularly for agriculture. So a lot of that's still going to be around carrot, I suspect, in terms of how if it's basic payment, what the conditions are on it. So there's the kind of conditionality around that. There's obviously the regulatory stick, which we have for our nitrate vulnerable zones, for various practices in terms of obviously, cross compliance under the current scheme. So I think those kind of mechanisms are going to be, particularly around regulation, they're going to be ones which apply to whichever catchment you're in, they're going to apply to you as a land user. I think where it comes into the carrots, I would expect that there will be some mandatory actions which every farmer in Scotland takes. There will have to be, because this is the beauty of a regional approach, is some which are more appropriate in some regions than others, and so you can imagine a voluntary component there which reflects that those regional differences, and actually the difference between Kintyre, for instance, where we have our small holding, compared to East Lothian. The options we would take under that menu would be very different based on our climate and the types of soils we have.
Can I bring in Finlay?
Thank you. Yeah, it's all really interesting. I just wonder, you talk about return on investment, and there's two ways to look at that. There's the return on investment financially that a land manager might make, but there's also the return on investment in terms of the benefit to the climate and carbon. Can you see these sort of schemes being set up on we're talking about regional landscape partnerships, whatever, and catchment scale type projects. Can you see rural payments being devolved right down to regional land use partnership size or even less to ensure we get the right financial incentives for planting broadleaf, for example, over planting Sitka? And then there's a balance between the return on investment financially and also in regards to carbon.
I don't really see that because of the issue of that kind of devolution of budgets. The major risk there is that we might have some great success in particular areas, but then it's the aggregate. With Scotland, we need to get to net zero. We need to do it in a sustainable way. And the risk there is that you lose that control. You have unintended consequences in terms of what a particular region or a regional board, end up doing. And so I think it still needs that central control to meet what are national objectives. So yes, the nuance needs to be there in terms of a menu and things which are that give some flexibility, but it can't just be a kind of free for all for what works for a particular region, because that needs to kind of contribute to the national effort in the right way.
And now Liz Smith.
It's just a very quick question just on the back of the discussion we've just been having, and it's very much about some of the agri-environment schemes, particularly around the model of clusters, which quite a lot of farmers and people in conservation would like to have adopted more speedily in Scotland. Do you think that's a good model? I think it's been working in England since 2012, if I'm not mistaken. Where you think that's a good model and what we have to do to promote it?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back a little bit like the catchment question, just in terms of how our natural environment behaves. It's not in farm-sized parcels. Actually, if we think about a lot of our species, for instance, we need corridors for them to be able to migrate. We need certain sizes of, say, woodland to get certain species, to give them the conditions they need. We need the edge effects, all those things. And so looking at it on a single farm basis, particularly around biodiversity, you're going to miss opportunities. So yes, that certainly needs to be part of the thinking. That's where a catchment scale actually gives you a lot of opportunity to do that. Clearly, even with catchment scales, you're going to want stuff which goes across several catchments for some of our objectives. So it's not like the catchments are that's where it ends in terms of integration. But I think certainly, that kind of cluster approach and looking at, again, it's the system. So systems thinking is, I know Peter was talking about what he teaches his students. We teach ours a lot about systems, about how everything has a knock-on effect. And this is a perfect case in point that actually, when we're looking at our biodiversity objectives, but also water quality, air quality, and climate, It is looking at not just that small scale farm and saying I'm getting it right here, but actually can we get it right for the system, if it's a species, if it's water quality, etc.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now back to Mark Ruskell.
Do you think there are areas of government policy that are contradictory in delivering a green recovery? And if you do think there are areas there, then how do you think we should go about addressing those contradictions?
Yes, it's been really nice looking from the outside and not having to be in government or a politician because green recovery, in terms of balancing the PFG and the short-term support that people need, but trying to think, okay, long-term we've still got the climate emergency. So that's really hard to not have some contradictions there, because you're having to do immediate, I guess, or make immediate decisions, which might not always give you the time to go, actually, is this compatible in terms of getting to net zero? So it's not my area, as you know, but transport would be one where I guess there's a real risk of contradictions coming actually from pre-COVID, where if we had a road building project that was approved, large amount of investment, and now we're in a situation where our travel habits have changed radically. It remains to be seen whether we'll just go back to what we were before COVID, but I suspect we weren't. And at the same time, we still have that context of needing to get to net zero. But the equation has changed, actually, for a lot of those kind of things in terms of, the projected numbers of, say, road users, just as an example. I'm stepping outside my area of expertise, obviously. But on those kind of things, there's a risk that you just go ahead with them because they were approved before, but you don't take the new context into account. And so that's then contradictory in terms of a green recovery, because you're not applying those green recovery principles of saying, does it avoid lock-in to high carbon? Does it create green, sustainable jobs? Is it just in terms of its application? So I suppose the biggest contradiction at the moment is in terms of the timescales and the kind of where you take money from and where you put it to. I suppose it's not so much a contradiction, it's a risk of a contradiction. If those things are if things are carried over from pre-COVID without reassessment, actually, of this new context and reassessment of, like I say, how people are travelling, but also what the demands are, just in terms of the extra pressure we've got on rural communities, the extra pressure on young people, in terms of employment, employment across Scotland. I don't see any glaring contradictions in PFG, but I think there's a real risk that over this coming couple of years, we will see those simply because we're carrying over what was pre-COVID in terms of decisions.
And now to Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, convener. Professor Ray, you're a member of the Climate Emergency Response Group, and one of the things that's come from there is a suggestion of 100 million for an agriculture modernisation fund. And I suppose the question is, where did that number come from? How does it relate to specific things that help us understand what level of public support there should be to agriculture in making their proper contribution to a net zero economy?
So the 100 million came from that was for a 3-year support plan, and it's so you'll be familiar with the Agricultural Modernisation Fund, which is a smaller amount, which the government have committed to. What our fund was really focused on was a proportion of capital payments for kits which would allow farmers to make that transition to lower carbon practices. It had a very big emphasis actually on the capacity building. So it wasn't about capital spend, it was about the training, so the advisory services, it was about decision support tools was a large part in that as well. So thinking about going back to that land capability assessment, which we can do on reasonably high resolution, but actually thinking about that kind of decision support system for farmers. So, linking back to the information that they're receiving in terms of, say, soil carbon and the advice you might get in terms of how you increase that, actually that needs investment. It needs the people to give the advice, again, people like the Farm Advisory Service, but it also needs the upskilling of the community in terms of the farmers themselves. So that's where that number kind of came in aggregate. So it was a mix of capacity building, technology, and capital spend on kit. Where we are with the Agricultural Transformation Fund is that's focused just on capital spend on kit and is a much smaller amount. So looking at, and the details have only just been released, obviously, about what's included in there. There's some good stuff, definitely, in terms of things like covers for slurry stores, things which will reduce, certainly that would reduce things like ammonia emissions. There's some fairly generic equipment that is eligible that will, I guess, help productivity, and so that indirectly can reduce the emissions intensity of production. But yeah, it's not one where on the Climate Emergency Response Group, like most of these groups, we do a green, amber, red analysis in terms of Scottish Government response. And for that one, it's definitely an amber, because it kind of, yes, there's a good response, and obviously the community need it. But there's a real question there still about the capacity building element that we'd like to see a lot more investment in.
It seems that on average 100 million is about 7,000 or 8,000 per farmer, or at least per claimant under the basic payments. So what would we actually spend that on? You've talked about some of the things that the 40 million from the Transformation Fund would buy, but you talk about training and things like that. Can you be a bit more specific? I'm not sure I've got my mind around what the 100 million you're proposing would actually buy.
Yeah, so we had, I'll send you the detailed breakdown, Stuart, of the 100 million. So it had around a third of it was similar to what is committed to in terms of that kind of capital kit funding. We had about a third which was for development and implementation of this decision support tool. So this would be something, as I described, which would cross both arable and livestock and help the farmers and the advisory support service to actually look at what you need to do and what return you'll get in terms of reduced emissions or increased productivity. And the other third was very much focused on providing that educational support to the farmers and retraining or upskilling the farm advisory service. So it was basically those three components that added up to the 100 million over 3 years. Obviously, to put that into context, though, that's a drop in the ocean in terms of what we need across the agriculture sector to align to net zero. So if we're thinking about the kind of £500 million support that we have in Scotland per year at the moment under CAP, you're looking at probably a third of that amount every year needs to be going towards our alignment with net zero. So much more than 100 million over 3 years.
Thank you. We want to come back for a final line of questioning. You have mentioned already about skills. If we can delve a little bit deeper, questions from Claudia Beamish.
Quite a lot of that has actually been covered already, but can I ask you, Professor Ray, if you're convinced that the opportunities in this area will be harnessed by Scottish Government, and how do you see this all being coordinated in an effective and robust way, taking into account the advisory service you've highlighted and also new entrants and retraining? If you could expand on that a little more, as it's so vital to the future of the pilots and the future of land use in Scotland. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it goes wider than just our sector in terms of agriculture, but I think for our sector, it's one that we all knew was already there, just in terms of how rapidly farming has changed anyway, but also in terms of the changes which need to come with net zero. I guess I liked this identification in the programme for government that Nature Scot would do a gaps analysis in terms of the skills provision, not just on farm, but actually for the whole of Scotland's rural landscape. So thinking about what gaps we've got in tree planting, peatland restoration, ideally in things like deer control, in invasive species, all of these things, we are really important in terms of delivering carbon sequestration as well as cutting emissions. All of them also are high labour. So actually in terms of their fit with green recovery, there's a really strong one there. So I really welcome that analysis of Nature Scot. I suppose this goes back to what Benny was saying, it's all about action. And so the conversations are happening already with further education and higher education in Scotland about how well we're aligned. Are we kind of already delivering the output of graduates or college leavers who have the skills? And we all know that we don't. There are gaps there that we need to fill, particularly in the context of what's happened with COVID and the different pressures that's brought to bear and the change in job market. I think one of the crucial things is going to be all of our institutions not just looking inwardly and going, okay, what does our curriculum deliver for the kind of land use goals in Scotland, but actually talking to employers, talking to those local authorities. It's kind of, I'm expecting the climate emergency action plan from Skills Development Scotland to be really useful, to be a great view about where skills and training need to go in Scotland, not just for agriculture and land use, but across all sectors. But it won't be able to go down to, a bit like we were talking about with the regional land use partnerships, it won't be able to go down to those local scales by itself. It won't be able to say, what does Edinburgh need and what does Edinburgh University need to do from the perspective of my institution? So those conversations need to happen between those educational providers and their community, their employers, the local authority, their city, in my case, to actually say, are we aligned? Can we look at our curriculum, look at our delivery, look at our graduate attributes and make sure that actually we are lined up, not just in time, because that's crucial, that actually we want graduates to have the skills for jobs that exist. So CCS came up with DETA. We have a carbon capture and storage masters, but the jobs at the moment, there aren't many of them around. So it needs to line up in time so that there are jobs to go into, but it needs to line up in space as well. So if we're looking at really key demands, whether it's in the northeast of Scotland in terms of a transition to offshore wind and CCS, are the educational providers there aligned with that? If we're in the kind of the west of Scotland, are we, particularly FE, but also HE, are we actually providing the skills and training for what people need on the ground? This coming tree planting season, just about to start, a couple of months, have we got the people in place? Have we got the curriculum in place? So yeah, it goes beyond just our sector. I think it's come through. I've managed to listen to all the evidence this morning. It's come through again and again, right from Benny's report. Actually, I think it was in the foreword. The education is at the heart of this, and part of that is lining things up in space and time, and that's certainly true for agriculture and land use.
Can I just put in a little bit here, because and rightly so, there's been a big focus on young people and upskilling young people and providing them the path that are going to get them the sustainable jobs and the training. But there's also an awful lot of people who are not going to be able to go to college and university who's maybe already working in sectors, are halfway through their working life, and they're going to need skills to be able to adapt. So, I mean, I want your views on the best delivery mechanisms, because it won't just be full-time education, it will be picking up the skills and accreditations that allow people to transition as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've got changes in mode of delivery, which can increase accessibility. So going back to Stuart's question, this was part of what we were looking at in terms of educational provision for farmers was CPD. It wasn't farmers, going on sabbatical and coming to Edinburgh University for a year. It was actually training while they're still doing their job. I think the mode of delivery can help with that. Obviously, online provision is something that's improved, and we've got some good mechanisms like the what's it called, the Flexible Workforce Fund, in terms of actually work-based placements where you're getting the skills that you need. So you're upskilling, but you're still doing your job. So I think those mechanisms are they're crucial, because although a lot of the emphasis, yes, needs to be on young people because they're being hammered just in terms of their opportunities. There are lots of really hugely talented people across Scotland who also might be underemployed rather than unemployed, and actually that upskilling while they're at the continual professional development, actually that can mean they're able to help with the transition to net zero and actually increase the amount of the work they're doing. So yeah, we shouldn't forget about that. I think our university, like all universities, we represent that too. So we have a lot of lifelong learning as part of our provision. And again, that's something which, when we're looking at our curriculum and our provision, we need to ask the question. I think we all, as educational providers, need to ask this question: is that still fit for purpose, given the changing conditions that we've got? So more people looking for work, more people who might be underemployed as well as unemployed. Yes, we want to do the right thing for 17 and 18-year-olds, but we want to do the right thing right across the spectrum of the students at Edinburgh, whatever age they are.
And we have a final question from Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, I was just picking up on what you're saying, Dave, about the need to switch about a third of agricultural subsidies towards meeting this net zero objective. And I'm just wondering, what does Scotland look like as we do that? What would be the changes on the ground that you would find would be most noticeable?
Is whether it's a switch of a current third or whether the total budget is a third of what we've got now. So that will have a huge impact in terms of what farming looks like. So, and that figure is just a downscaling from what the Committee on Climate Change estimated for the UK CAP budget versus what in their land use and net zero report they estimated the cost of delivery would be. I think obviously the weighting of that is probably going to be a bit higher for Scotland based on our greater capacity for things like carbon sequestration, actually. I think the landscape in Scotland, we're going to see more trees, and I absolutely welcome the acceleration in tree planting, and that is something which I know there's the risk about trees in the wrong place, but actually we've got a great research base to make sure we get that right, and particularly if that is integrated with what works socially as well as physically in terms of those trees going in. So that expansion will mean, I guess by the middle of the century that we'll have up to 30% woodland cover in Scotland versus around 20 at the moment. So, another tree, if you've got 2 trees, we'll have 3 trees on average. I think one of the major things that all of us are aware of with the agricultural system in Scotland is that we cannot afford to offshore our emissions. So one of the things we can't afford is to lose our agricultural production. Our farmers are crucial in delivering net zero, but as part of that, producing food which the world already loves, that has, a major, such a strong name, but actually is also very efficiently produced in the main. So we have a lower carbon footprint for a lot of our commodities that we produce than the global average, and actually we beat Europe for a lot of our production. So we can't afford to lose that, because we'll still need to eat, and so we'll just offshore the emissions. So that's a key thing. So we'll still see farming. We need to still see farming in Scotland. That is vital. But we will need to see also, like I say, more of the nature-based solutions like peatland restoration and tree planting. I suppose the big danger for us at the moment, well, over the next 10 years for agriculture, is that we get left behind, actually, the rest of Europe, England, in terms of our agricultural practices, that we try and protect it too much. It does need protecting, it's vital for us, but protecting in a way which just is business as usual means we will lose competitive advantage. We've got a great name for the quality of the produce, and we can boast quite rightly about the environmental credentials on average of Scottish produce. But if we sit on our hands and just keep going with a kind of business as usual, let's try and protect it, actually other nations will overtake us. Consumers will demand really high environmental standards, particularly around climate change and biodiversity. And so there's a real danger, actually, for us that if we haven't changed quite radically in terms of land use and agriculture by 2030, the whole sector will be really vulnerable. So I'm really optimistic that actually we've got that natural capital that's been talked about a few times today to actually put Scotland food and drink where it should be, on top of the world in terms of environmental quality and in terms of its reputation. But in terms of that transition that we're going to see, it's going to have to be quite radical. So it is going to be a substantial increase in tree planting, and for some of our, for instance, where we are out in the west in Kintyre, at the moment it's sheep fields, mainly where I am. There are going to be more trees, so it is going to look different, but that is going to be hopefully something which rewards the landowner, increases that natural capital, and across Scotland we're still able to produce the food that we need. So that's the aim, that's the goal.
I did say that was going to be the final question, but Finlay has asked to come in very briefly before we round off. Finlay.
Dave, at the risk of not leaving this session with a strong message you've just given us about the future of agricultural and rural support, there's one very, very quick thing. Do we have to, or are we at risk of compromising biodiversity? And we forget about the biodiversity crisis we also face by concentrating so much on climate change and carbon. How do we get the balance right? Is there enough thought being given to the impact of biodiversity of planting more trees, or potentially losing grazing by reducing our livestock production, whatever? Is that given enough regard?
That's a good question, Finlay. And as you know, I often warn about the carbon blinkers. Climate change is something which dominates our. Certainly for me, it keeps me awake at night, and it gives me blinkers, because I kind of think, right, does this address climate change? And as a climate change scientist, that gives me a bias, actually. And there are dangers there in terms of doing things which are just about delivering on carbon, which can very negatively affect, for instance, biodiversity. So I think you were talking with Dieter about Sitka spruce, a good example there, where if it's just about carbon, that's going to give you a really fast growth rate, but clearly it's not just about that. And so there's a danger there. I think it's maybe overplayed, because we know that we've made the mistakes in the past in terms of planting trees in the wrong places on deep peat, and the cost that had in terms of carbon as well as biodiversity. So that comes back to partly to the research base and that land capability, and making an informed decision about where you're putting trees in, for instance. One of the challenges, this is going to come back to all of you ultimately, and maybe then via these regional land use partnerships and those kind of boards, is it will come down to some of the trade-offs. So what we can hopefully provide you as a research base in Scotland and as academics is lots of tools and to give you the information on what the trade-offs are. The decision to, what you prioritise and what trade-off you're willing to make, ultimately that's going to come down to politicians to make that call. So we can give you the objective view of this is what you'll get in terms of carbon, and this might be the cost in terms of, say, air quality. But then which is best, that's less our job, thankfully.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time this morning, Professor Ray. That concludes our public session today, and we continue with our Green Recovery inquiry in subsequent weeks. The next meeting on the 15th of September, the committee will take further evidence on the Green Recovery inquiry, but that concludes the public part of our meeting today. Thank you all.